Welcome to The Evolution of Torah, a history of rabbinic literature, a JTS podcast introducing you to the first 1,000 years of rabbinic literature with Rabbi Mordechai Schwartz. This is episode 4, Midrash, Making Meaning.
David Zvi Hoffman was a rabbi in Germany in the late 19th century. He was also one of a new breed, a modern scholar of rabbinic literature. He was aware of several collections of Midrash that had disappeared. One of these was the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, an important Midrash from the school of Rabbi Akiva. This work had been lost. It simply didn't make the transition to the printing press from the texts that were copied out by hand by scribes in the Middle Ages. But certain passages were preserved in medieval commentaries on the Torah. New travel technologies like steam and rail allowed previously isolated Jewish communities to share their texts with each other. Yemenite collections of Midrash made it to Europe in the 19th century. Among these was a Midrash that was called the Midrash Hagadol, the big Midrash, literally. This Midrash anthologized from earlier Midrashim, but it did not contain any citations or references to the texts from which they had anthologized. Hoffman claimed he could tell, just by the style of the paragraphs in the Midrash Hagadol, which of those paragraphs came from the Mechilta de Rashbi. He took these paragraphs and edited them together as a way of reconstructing the Midrash that he thought had existed. He published his results in 1888, calling it the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it was published under that name. A little bit less than a decade later, when the Cairo Geniza was discovered and came into the hands of Solomon Schechter, amongst the various fragments that they found there were copies of the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And the amazing thing is that Hoffman had been largely right. He really had been able to reconstruct this Midrash. The Midrashic tradition was large indeed, and many Midrashim were lost. As I mentioned in the last episode, the reason for the small size of the Yerushalmi, one possible reason anyway, is that the Talmud of the land of Israel was not the main focus of rabbinic learning in the land of Israel. There was a huge Midrashic tradition. In many ways, Midrash preserves lost rabbinic traditions or alternative paths that could have been taken. Though we don't have all of these collections, what we do have expands our knowledge of the diversity of the rabbinic movement in the land of Israel. So now I'm going to ask, what is Midrash? It is a genre of rabbinic literature. It's a genre that's deeply tied up with Scripture. It's interpretations of verses and of smaller units within the Torah itself. If there is no verse, then it is not Midrash. One simple example. The Shema passage from Deuteronomy 6 tells us that we should say it b'shochbecha uvkumecha, when you lie down and when you rise up. But it's not clear what that means. Does it mean personally when I go to sleep? Personally when I wake up? Midrash fills this in. It says that it's when most people go to sleep, that is, when nightfall occurs, and when most people wake up. That is, the first third of the morning. We call this Midrash Halakha. Midrash Halakha is mostly legal. Halakha is the term that we use for Jewish law. That said, it also deals with narrative portions of the Torah. What makes Midrash Halakha really Midrash Halakha is that it is from the same time period as the Mishnah. There seem to have been two schools of Midrash Halakha, the school of Rabbi Akiva, which accepted more fanciful interpretations of verses, and the school of Rabbi Yishmael, that insisted on the simple meaning, the most basic meaning, of the verses and the language of those verses. The popularity of the study of Midrash Halakha amongst 19th century rabbinic scholars was because of the diversity of techniques that one finds in these collections of Midrash. They represent rabbinic paths that were not taken. And for modern Jews, this feels very relevant because of the diversity of practices, the diversity of approaches that we see in the modern period. I want to talk now about narrative Midrash. We call this Midrash Agadah. Agadah means narrative. We can sort of think of this as rabbinic fan fiction. The rabbis are fans of the Torah, but just like fan fiction, there's a dissatisfaction when there are gaps in the narrative or when there's a lack of detail. And so they create this narrative Midrash as a way of filling in these gaps. So I want to give you two examples from a collection we call Genesis Rabbi, which is on the book of Genesis, two examples from the childhoods of our patriarchs, which is missing in these narratives in the Torah itself. So the first of these is a story that many of you might know, the story of Abraham and the idols, that when Abraham was a child, according to this Midrash, he already objected to idol worship, which was a problem because his father was a seller of idols. So the story concludes with him smashing these idols to make an ideological point. And this story comes and fills in the gap about Abraham's childhood. Many people think the story is in the Torah, but it's actually not. It's in a collection of Midrash. Another story that we have is about the childhood of Jacob and Esau. That when Jacob and Esau were young, when they were school age, they went to the study house, and both of them followed their parents' dictates. But when they turned 13, Jacob went one way to the study house, and Esau went another to worship idols. And the story here concludes with the idea that a parent is no longer responsible for their child after the age of 13, that the child is able to make his or her own religious decisions from that point on. And the Midrash even includes a blessing that is often recited at children's B'nai Mitzvah. So we see here that we actually do have some kind of a practice that comes out of this Midrash. But this is a little bit unusual. There is a clear shift of focus from legal Midrash to narrative Midrash in this somewhat later period of the 2nd century. So why did the focus shift? It's not entirely clear, but we think that it was the Mishnah, which we called a watershed before, that it had a major cultural effect of ending direct legal interpretation of Scripture. And from that point on, it was really the interpretation of Mishnah that determined legal practice, whereas Midrash became more focused on understanding the narratives of the Torah. So what else is Midrash? In my opinion, we can look at other Jewish interpretations like Kabbalah or modern Midrash, and we can actually see that there are some versions of these things that are real Midrash, that use real rabbinic techniques of interpreting verses. So what is Kabbalah? It's a form of Jewish mysticism whose early works are really kind of like Midrashim in that they're focused on verses. But instead of trying to derive a halakha, a law from those verses, or to understand the gaps in a narrative, it's focused on using those verses as a way of encountering God directly, to gain a mystical experience. There's also something we call modern Midrash. Is this really Midrash? Yes. You can make Midrash today if it is grounded in the knowledge of the rabbinic tradition and follows the tradition of interpreting the verses of the Torah itself. People today use modern Midrash as a way of creating new practices and filling in narrative gaps in a way that is more palatable to a modern taste. Rabbi Jill Hammer, who is an alumnus of JTS, has multiple collections of modern Midrash which attempt to include previously marginalized members of the Jewish community, including women, LGBTQ Jews, and disabled Jews. There are also new forms. Peter Pitzela created a form called bibliodrama, which attempts to use a kind of theatrical workshopping of the verses to uncover new meaning in the verses and to fill in narrative gaps. So I think what we have here is what Barry Wimpheimer, who's a scholar of rabbinics at Northwestern, calls an expanded Talmud. That when you think of the Talmud, you shouldn't just think of the collection that we call the Babylonian Talmud, but you have to think of the whole of rabbinic tradition. All of these midrashim, including modern midrashim, and a whole range of medieval and modern commentaries. So this brings up the question, what do we mean when we talk about the close of the Talmud? When we talk about the Talmud as a canonical text that has a specific endpoint in time? And we'll talk about that next time.
Thanks for listening to The Evolution of Torah, A History of Rabbinic Literature from JTS with Professor Mordechai Schwartz. It was recorded here at JTS by Larry Camiola and produced by Rabbi Tim Bernard. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can find all of JTS's podcasts at www.jtsa.edu/podcasts, and you can send us an email at onlinelearning@jtsa.edu. Please support JTS podcasts and other community learning programs by visiting jtsa.edu/podcastgiving to donate.